Hi, I'm Zhanwei Chan, and I lead Checkpoint's IoT business over in Asia. Today, I'm going to talk to you about how smart devices and IoT is a threat to compliance and digital transformation in an organization. I'm going to start by sharing with you two customers that has this challenge of securing their OT and IoT environment. The first customer is one of world's largest FMCG manufacturer, and they have over 100 over OT sites or factories. However, they also have thousands over IoT sites, and this includes warehouse, supply chain, experience center, and etc. On the OT environment, the factories, they do have a lot of heavy investment and they focus heavily on securing the OT environment because a secure OT environment is equivalent to uptime. They use a lot of specialized tools and they have provided their cybersecurity team with heavy OT cybersecurity training. However, when it comes to the IoT side, they have a very diverse environment, multitudes of IoT providers, and in this case, they do have to justify for ROI. I share with you this example because this customer, although they are big, they still have to justify their spending. They still have to identify and put in a lot of effort to identify and to train and to secure as an ongoing effort on their OT and IoT sites. The second customer I wanted to share with you is a healthcare organization, a radiology and imaging clinic over here in Australia, New Zealand. They have about 70 sites or clinic within the region. And as you know, all these imaging equipment are extremely costly, can cost up to $1 million. And every time this device goes down, obviously they have to turn away patient because they can't provide the patient care that their business offered. But don't forget, for this equipment includes not only the MRI machine, but the computers managing the MRI, which usually runs on Windows, and obviously the administration workstation that's used to call a patient and to do patient scheduling and for billings and to share patient record with external healthcare providers. So when you talk about healthcare or OT, IoT, it's not only about that specific device, but all the equipment that surround it. And these equipments are usually in the specific OT or IoT network. For this specific customer, their aim is to identify all the assets that's there. And I use the term asset because we are now including the Windows workstation used by administrator. And we need to monitor them for threats. So it's a standard use case. However, how do you manage, identify, monitor threats for a non-Windows machine like an MRI machine? So let me just redefine a little bit what is IoT. In Checkpoint, OT IoT includes everything. Starting from the top left, you have the traditional industrial equipment on the OT equipment that's used by electricity, water, energy on the utility side that is used to control and to monitor the utility network. You have manufacturing, and this is the vast majority of OT, MES, DCS environment that's out there, and these are the factory floors. The third category are the healthcare, and this includes the MRI machine, the ECG infusion pump, and etc. But don't forget, there's also the nurse workstation that is within the hospital, that is also within the separate network, and these are typical Windows machine. On the smart city front, you have the cameras, you have the environmental sensor, you have the pedestrian counting, and these are miniature networks that's out there. Although it may not be mission critical, however, if you think about it, environmental sensor is becoming more and more critical. Pollution, identifying pollution is becoming more and more critical, and congestion. In terms of building automation, you're talking about the traditional CCTV and door access, but the other thing is also the air conditioning system or the HVAC. In a very hot environment, on a very cold environment, the HVAC becomes extremely important because you may have to evacuate people within the building when the HVAC fails. And when the HVAC fails, the building becomes extremely hot or extremely cold for someone to be inside. So it is now becoming mission critical. The sixth category is the smart office. When I say smart office, you're talking about the video conferencing equipment. You're talking about the panel outside of the meeting room that is used to schedule meetings. You're talking about potentially again smart access. You're talking about smart printers. These are smart office. And if you can focus specifically on the video conferencing equipment, this has become extremely important in the last 2 years because we rely so heavily on them. Imagine if you have a very critical meeting and this video equipment fail, what is going to happen? But I also want to introduce to you the seventh category, which includes unmanageable device, unagentable devices. And this includes personal mobile phone, personal devices, and devices that you can't install an agent on, for example, a Mac laptop, and even a printer that is out there in connecting to your corporate user network that needs to run there, and things like UPS that is sitting under someone's desk to power the desktops. So these are extremely has becoming more and more critical to a business operation. So in summary, OT IoT in Checkpoint includes every single device. The difference is this device critical to your business operation? Is video conferencing critical to you? Imagine shutting down all the video conferencing for a week. Imagine there's no printer or you prevent people from bringing in their own personal device. How is it going to affect your business operation? And HVACs and environmental sensor. So we are here to ask the difficult question and to challenge the use of this equipment in a business setting. Let me share with you some cybersecurity threats in the past, and I think this is important. Although it has been a few years ago, it is important to understand that cybersecurity threats does not just exist in the IT world, but they exist in the OT, IoT, and general assets world. The first one that I wanted to share with you is Oldsmar Water Utility over in Florida that have been hacked in February 2021, where they could have potentially poisoned 15,000 people. The only reason why they have not been poisoned is because someone was sitting in front of the control station where the hacker has literally already changed the chlorine level to a dangerous level. The engineer saw that and he has quickly addressed the problem, and that saved 15,000 people. But the access from external to internal, there is nothing new. The team viewer has been allowed, and the credential is an existing credential. So there were no red flag from the access perspective. The only red flag was the change of chlorine to a very dangerous level. Honda was also attacked back in June. I believe this is year 2020. Apologies for the mistake. And I believe this is eCan's malware, and they needed to shut down 9 plants. Obviously, Honda is one of the bigger story that's out there. There is a lot more cyber attack that needs a factory to be shut down, and they are usually not shared. Polycom, which is a video conferencing device, there's a known botnet affecting all the equipment from running, and this is back in February 2019. So like I've mentioned earlier, imagine shutting down all your video conference equipment for a day or two, and you have a very critical executive level meeting or contract signing meeting between 2 different countries, and this equipment failed. It is now become mission critical. The fourth example that I want to share with you is a failure in a point of sale system. And I wanted to use this because point of sale system is usually managed by a third party. Again, although it is managed by a third party, all this equipment has become so critical to the business operation of Coop that they needed to shut 700 stores for 6 days. And this is back in July 2021. The last example is from organization called Kennex, where they provide smart building facilities. Um, there has been some undisclosed cyber attack. They did not mention who, and it's available on their homepage. This is back in November 2021, last year. And the solution that they provide is to implement a secure VPN between the remote engineer and the building automation system. But we know that secure VPN is not going to be sufficient because we have been using VPN for years. And we know that malware does not attack the secure VPN itself. Malware attacks the lowest hanging fruit, which is usually the user, via email or via social engineering. And from there, it affects the IT network. And from the IT network, it affects the OT, IoT, and the peripheral network that it's connected to. So that's how a malware exists. It does not really attack the VPN. So these are the threats. And how would it affect your compliance? So there's a few compliance framework that an organization may need to address. CIS controls, there's a few. Under CIS, you have to identify the inventory. You have to identify all the assets in your enterprise, assets in your software. You have to provide individual login credentials. You have to implement audit, and you have to do pen tests. The biggest challenge is how are you going to do this on a network that you can't scan, on a network that you have not been managing, on a network on assets that have been deployed 20 years ago where there's shared credential, where there's no audit logging, and an environment where you can't test. But I guess the biggest challenge that we have seen is when you use a vulnerability management scanning tool, you have to configure. You have one known network and you configure it and you scan. There's two challenges with this. The challenge number one is there is going to be an unknown network. How are you going to scan it? Because you do not know and therefore you can't configure. The second challenge is you have device moving in and out. When the device is not connected to the network, how are you going to scan the network? And I'm talking about personal devices. There's obviously in the next framework on the industrial side, your 62443, and it requires you to perform a few identification, understand the assets, perform risk assessment, identify the drawing, identify the threats, and monitor for controls. How are you going to do this? And we know that the traditional IT technology, the traditional IT cybersecurity tool, if you were to pick it up and drop it into the industrial network, your industrial network will just go flat out and fail, and all your system will shut down. So you can't use a traditional cybersecurity technology as it is. You need specialized technology, and it needs to be thought of very well. Over here in Australia, there's this thing called Essential 8 that you have to comply with. And it talks about identifying the application, installing patch on the application. And the challenge is how are you going to install a patch on a video conference device or on a printer that cannot be patched. A little bit more about compliance. So to summarize that, if there's a device that's out there in your network, whether it's deployed 10 years ago or by a separate team, an unknown device represents an unknown risk, and that's a compliance issue. Even if you know about those devices, most of the time or sometimes you can scan. Or in this case, it's simple. You do not know that device, you can scan it, and therefore it is a vulnerability gap that you can't report on. And this is true for things that you can't install an agent on, that's transient, moving in and out. For roaming devices, we know that the latest smartphone, they changed their MAC address, but it is the same device. How are you going to report on when you have 10 devices, but they changed their MAC address? And now do you have 100 assets or do you have 10 assets? So these are some of the compliance challenges that organization is facing in terms of reporting. And when we talk about digital transformation, we are talking about remote access. We are talking about extremely fast, providing access when it's needed. And from a cybersecurity perspective, we enforce accountability and we enforce a secure, and we enforce a secure access. So how do we identify this? You have third party that's accessing the network. The OT IoT network uses shared credential, and it's difficult to enforce, or to make a change because it requires an upgrade of devices. And most of all, you need external connection from the internet. So how do you implement ZTNA or Zero Trust Network Access into this OT IoT environment? To bring it all up, the root cause is because you have a device that can't be agent, that you cannot install an agent on. For the last couple of years, we have been deploying EDR, EPP onto endpoints, onto servers, onto managed laptops. But there are a lot of devices, OT, IoT, and IT device that you can't install an agent on because they could be not supported or it could be a personal device. Fine. Usually, the IT administrator will put them then on a separate network. Okay, so it doesn't impact mission critical devices. However, when you put it on a separate network, it becomes unscannable because all your vulnerability management tool and all your cybersecurity tools on a managed network. So now you have this separate network that cannot be scanned, and typically no one knows what assets are out there. But most important of all, these devices cannot be patched and cannot be upgraded easily. So the term that I like to use is, imagine there's a Windows XP out there that's generating $100,000 that no one knows of. How do you secure that device? So let me bring you some of the solution that, or a customer journey that we've seen. We first have to start with the ability to see, which is to generate the visibility. In this case, we always use a sensor on a sensitive network, OT, IoT, because you cannot scan it actively. And also, using sensor, we are able to pick up all the devices that are moving in and out and to identify them before a vulnerability management or vulnerability scanner can pick it up. So the first thing that the customer do, that we help the customer with, is to identify all these assets. In this particular customer, you're talking about us being able to identify 85% of all unmanaged devices, and this represents 64,000 devices. Once a device has been discovered, we identify the cybersecurity risk. The same customer that I'm talking about, we have managed to identify about 18,000 devices that has high risk. And of course, we also discover the CVE, the risky activity, and we recommend the patch. Once we have also integrated with Active Directory and wireless LAN controller to get more context. And the third capability, after identifying these devices, is to create a connection profile. Who is it connecting to? Where is it coming from? Where is it connecting to? So the connection profile. Because with this connection profile, we are able to discover risky and anomaly behavior. So this is the start, to use a sensor to gain an understanding and to gain visibility. The second part of the journey is to do the enforcement. Now, just a very big caveat here, enforcement does not necessarily mean blocking, but to start with, you can generate a high severity rule to your notification system. But in terms of enforcement, your first line of defense is actually a network segmentation. And second line of defense is to perform virtual patching. And usually this is done when you have a firewall in place, a next generation firewall in place. Don't forget, in the next generation firewall, you do have a lot of nice features like anti-bot, anti-malware, and even DLP capability. So if you have not upgraded your firewall, remember, it is your first line of defense and you do have to upgrade them. That's the second module, which is to enforce, and the enforcement provides you with access and etc. The third item is to overlay an additional remote access. So this is where you can see the value of ZTNA being more pronounced. And this includes things like session recording that promotes accountability, overlaying and integrate into an Active Directory, and that allows existing user to be managed more effectively. Plus, there's no change required on the endpoint that, or no agent required to be installed on the endpoint that you're on the IoT endpoint. So within this three outcome itself, you now have the understanding of what all these devices are and where it's located and what it does. You have a level of enforcement around it, predominantly using firewall, and you have a remote access system that allows people to remotely connect and to monitor at the same time. So that's how a basic ZTNA for IoT can be achieved. From a technical perspective, number one, you have a sensor on the left, and most of the time we deploy the sensor via a port mirror. With the sensor, and because we are monitoring the network, we can ensure almost 100% coverage of all activity. The remaining 1% that is not there, or 0.1%, is because the asset have not been connected to the network, or it's a really isolated network that's sitting alone down there, not even have RJ45 or network card or wireless card connected to the network. So by doing a port mirror, by monitoring the network, we have high capability to understand the network. Number two, once the asset has been identified, it then goes into being profiled and categorized in terms of functionality, in terms of make, manufacturer, make, model, brand, serial number, and even what protocol it uses. The third item, but that's what I meant about first line of defense. Remember, malware access via IT to OT most of the time. There are malware like Stuxnet that's introduced directly. However, most of the time, what we see is it's an IT malware that has managed to infiltrate to OT. So firewall, next generation firewall is your first line of defense. If you can install the firewall into your internal segmentation, even better. Now you can increase your availability and your uptime by further segmenting all the critical controls. Like I've mentioned, next-gen firewall do offer you a lot more capabilities and features because it has moved into stateful inspection. It has moved into anti-bot, anti-malware application level. The fourth item is remote access. So you now know what is out there. You can enforce it. Now is to provide a remote user with access into the OT IoT network. The remote access server functions as a two-way connector. However, when it integrates with the firewall, it now becomes it can now do additional enforcement. From a user perspective, you also have to identify should the user install an agent or be agentless. Typically, what we see is if an agent is installed, you do have a lot more granularity. You do have a lot more control. You know, for example, if you can install an agent on a laptop, that particular laptop would be quite secure because there's an additional level of control. We know that for years ago, the number one attack location, the attack surface is actually a laptop. So securing the laptop is actually not a bad idea. B, for bonus, if there's integration between the sensor and the remote access to the firewall, you can even generate your firewall policy automatically or be recommended and for up to you to implement it. My advice is when it's recommended, implement it, but do not block. Change the rule to allow but generate a high level of severity instead. This way, it does not prevent your operation, it does not impact your operation, but it tells you if something is wrong. This is a technical solution in a very high level. And that's all I wanted to share. The basic concept is you cannot protect what you can't see. Therefore, remember the first step to secure and to make sure that your IoT OT is compliant and can start your digital journey is to identify them. Because the moment you identify them is when you can start to plan. You can't protect what you can't see. Thank you. My email and my LinkedIn profile is on the screen. Feel free to connect with me.